in the history of the West, you read all kinds of accounts of famous people's pistols, you know, Billy the Kid's pistol, Pat Garrett's pistol, Wired Earp's pistol. Here's the gun that killed Billy the Kid. Do you know all this stuff? But very few times do you see a weapon that is recorded indisputably in the court records by serial number, because that's the nice thing about guns. There's only one gun of this model with this number on the belly. So we know it was this exact gun. I'm going to talk to you today about John Wesley Hardin, because although I hate to call myself a fan of an outlaw, I'll just use that term loosely here today. I'm a big fan of John Wesley Hardin. We're talking to you today from a part of Texas called the Nueces Strip, which was the wildest, most outlaw-infested, treacherous, brutal part of Texas, all the way up until the 1920s, really. Down here in the Nueces Strip, I learned about John Wesley Hardin, and John Wesley Hardin was an enigma. For one thing, he was very intelligent. Over and over we see from the evidence that he was very smart, and he had some education. For example, when he was finally caught and sent to prison, he studied law, and when he emerged from prison, he obtained his law license to practice law, which he did. But today I want to kind of hit the high points of John Wesley Hardin's career, answering some myths about John Wesley Hardin. You can read all about John Wesley Hardin in all the books. There have probably been a dozen biographies written of this man, who was, in everybody's estimation, the best gun handler, the biggest gunfighter, the greatest gunfighter who ever lived. And I guess if you tally up what means great in terms of lives that he took, I guess that's probably true. Some say as many as 44 people he killed. Personally, I don't think that's exactly accurate, and I encourage you to read the books and come up with your own figure, but certainly we have concrete evidence for over 25 or so. John Wesley Hardin, like very many Old West outlaws, and this is probably one of the most important things to remember, was a product of Reconstruction in post-Civil War Texas. As you know, after the Civil War, the United States government sent representatives and installed state officers throughout the southern states to keep the government running, but these individuals that they usually installed in the positions of governor and senates and so forth through the southern states were mostly Republicans from up north. So those were referred to as Reconstruction personnel sent by the federal government to a South who did not welcome them. Here you had a milieu of Confederates throughout, let's just take Texas for example, and all of a sudden they are having to obey the rules of Reconstruction, non-resident legislators and so forth sent here by the federal government. So John Wesley Hardin was a product, like many other Texas outlaws, especially of the Reconstruction government in Texas. Wild Bill Longley You can think of a whole lot of other ones, but they were pretty much racist, and they didn't like black people, and they didn't like various segments, and they really made it rough on a lot of non-white individuals. But in John Wesley Hardin's case, until a few years ago, we thought he was born in 1853, but Doug Ellison, another member of the Wild West History Association, recently discovered that in fact he was born in 1852 in Bonham, Texas. And as you may suspect from his first name, John Wesley, he was named after the Methodist founder, and his father was a preacher too. So although he grew up with a church background, he soon sort of turned from that and became a wild child. Dr. Richard Marone, who has written what I think is the best biography of John Wesley Hardin, called The Last Gunfighter, was a criminal psychologist, and he got interested in John Wesley Hardin like I have, and he, in all of his degrees and qualified experience, set out to determine exactly what was the nature of John Wesley Hardin's personality and why did he do the things he did. Why did he kill so many people? Why did he spend his life doing nefarious activities and so forth? So that's an interesting read, and I encourage you to read that book. But the bottom line of that study was that John Wesley Hardin was what you might call an early day juvenile delinquent. He grew up fast, hard times, craved excitement, wanted immediate reward. All these psychological things made him sort of a wild, bad man. And he killed his first man at a very early age, early teenager, I think 13 or 14 years old in East Texas. And I won't go over all the murders that he committed, but he really took it out on the Reconstruction soldiers and people here in Texas who had been sent down here to preserve the law and order. But he really hated those kind of people. If you've heard of John Wesley Hardin, you've probably heard the famous story that he even once shot a man for snoring. So if we have time, I'll talk about that. But for today's sake, he was a bad dude. And he was quick, he was ruthless, he was smart, and you didn't want to cross John Wesley Hardin. Very few lawmen ever arrested him successfully. Jeff Milton was one of the few who did. I hope we get to talk about that today. But from his early life and all these troubles, John Wesley Hardin eventually had to flee Texas and go to Florida, is where he chose, because some of his in-laws were in Florida, and he landed near Pensacola, Florida. And he hid out a few years, had his wife with him, Jane Bowen, and he was hiding from the Texas Rangers, basically, because by that time he had committed so many crimes that the governor had placed a reward on his head, and he was afraid to come back to Texas. So eventually, the Texas Rangers learned where he was. I won't go into the details, but two of them, Jack Duncan and John Armstrong, learned his whereabouts near Pollard, Alabama, and Pensacola, Florida, and that he got on the train. So without a warrant, they followed him there and were able to overcome him in a train car when he was traveling on the train. And you can read all these details later, but I'm just going to kind of hit the high points of John Wesley Hardin. and the myths about John Wesley Hardin. The first myth that I want to discuss is, in spite of John Wesley Hardin's short duration of residence in El Paso, everybody connects John Wesley Hardin with El Paso. They think he lived there for years or he was a resident or whatever. Why? Because most all of the material produced concentrates just on that short period of time when John Wesley Hardin was in El Paso. As it turns out, he was there less than 6 months of his life. In fact, I think it was only 4 months. So, backtracking on his life, he goes on trail drives to Kansas, and he does all his activities. He got in gambling, and he's always into some mess, including the Sutton-Taylor feud over here, not too far from where we are today, in DeWitt County, and you can read all about that later. But he went to Kansas on the trail drive with his cousins, the Clements, and he returned and he murdered some more people, and first thing you know, he went to Florida then, and he came back. John Armstrong and Jack Duncan put him in jail, and he went to Austin, and he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison for the killing of Deputy Sheriff Charlie Webb in Comanche. And that, I think, was about 1877. So he was able to elude the law a long time after that, but they finally caught up with him, sentenced him to 25 years in prison. And as I mentioned a while ago, although he was not a very good prisoner at first, he certainly wasn't a model prisoner, but he eventually sort of succumbed to authority, which was very difficult for him. But he finally became a pretty good prisoner and was able to study law books and obtain his license to practice law. I have in my collection about 72 or so Hardin-related artifacts. One of them being the official government document issued by then Governor James Stephen Hogg pardoning John Wesley Hardin from prison. And it is the document that allowed him to practice law in Texas. So he served, I think, about 18 years of his 25-year sentence. Unfortunately, he had a very sad life by that time. Tragic events occurred. His beloved wife, Jane Bowen Hardin, died while he was in prison. He wasn't even able to go to her funeral. And he had already had, by that time, 3 children, which lived on after him around DeWitt County near Smiley and Yorktown and Cuero in there. Fast forward, he gets out of prison, and in 1894, by that time when he got out, he went immediately to Gonzales, which is where he spent most of his time, and he had vowed to support the local sheriff. A guy named Jones was running for sheriff also, and unfortunately John Wesley supported the other guy. Well, Jones got elected. In spite of Jones once letting him out of jail, it's a mystery why he was against the man who had helped him. But anyway, that's just another mystery about John Wesley Hardin. So he vowed that if Jones got elected, that he was going to leave his hometown of Gonzales, Texas. So in fact, when Jones was elected, he had to make good. So he hung up his shingle in Gonzales, trying to practice law. He had a couple of cases, but about that time he received a letter from his cousin, Jim Miller, who was related to the Clements side of John Wesley Hardin's life. Jim Miller had married Sally Clements, and Hardin was on the Taylor side of the Sutton-Taylor feud. So Jim Miller, by that time, had committed a crime in West Texas, so he summoned John Wesley Hardin to come to El Paso to defend him. And the venue, I never could understand why, when the crime was committed in Pecos, Texas, why they went to El Paso. Well, it turns out it was one of those cases of change of venue from Pecos, Texas, where Jim Miller's crime was committed, to El Paso. So that's why he ended up in El Paso. And if I remember right, that was about March of 1895. So now here, all of a sudden, we're down to the last 4 months of his life in El Paso. Yet, that is what you see most of the research and written material about. It gives you a erroneous idea of how long he was in El Paso. So in El Paso, he tried to go straight, but he eventually ended up in the same old bad habits of gambling and carousing and drinking at night and so forth. And he soon met what is termed a beautiful lady named Helen Beulah Morose. And it's just fascinating to read about his romance with Helen Beulah Morose. Beulah, as she went by, was married to a Polish fella named Martin Morose, and you see it spelled various ways, but the Polish spelling was M''R''O''Z, but you see it spelled all kinds of ways. Martin Morose was from right up here around Sutherland Springs, Helena, right around there, but he went to West Texas and he established a good cattle ranch, and he was successful, and he amassed a lot of land and cattle, and when he sold out, he got the whopping sum of about $2,500 or something like that. And he committed a couple of crimes which caused him to have to flee to Mexico to evade the authorities. So he jumped across the border and lived in Mexico for a while his wife, Beulah Morose, was on the U.S. side. Well, you might suspect what happened to a pretty lady with a lot of money in El Paso. John Wesley Hardin was immediately attracted to her for various reasons, and they soon took up habitation together in Ms. Herndon's boarding house. And there's some fascinating stories about Ms. Herndon talking about how fast he was with pistols. He would click his pistols and come around jumping aside and clicking them just as fast as he could go. She said he was absolutely the quickest thing ever. And all the lawmen agreed. The Texas Rangers once would, after they captured him from Florida, they handed him a pistol and let him perform some of his pistol acts, and they were all just amazed. There are stories about him even getting a drop on Wild Bill Hickok while Hickok was a marshal in Abilene. But anyway, back to the Morose story. Here you have John Wesley consorting with Beulah Morose, and her husband living right across the border, afraid to come across the border, and yet mad at her for spending her money with John Wesley Hardin. Well, things came to a head when lawman John Selman, who was El Paso City Constable, and John Scarborough and Frank McMahon, also Jeff Milton, who was the chief of police at the time, this was 1895, decided that they would capture Morose. Now, there's a lot of speculation, especially in Leon Metz's book, that Hardin was behind getting these lawmen to try to go get Morose, because if Morose was out of the way, you understand, then he got not only all the money, but the pretty lady too, just like the movies say. So it was in the summer of '95, I think June, when Jeff Milton, city chief of police El Paso, John Scarborough, who was Texas Ranger, Frank McMahon, who was deputy sheriff, and who did I leave out? McMahon, Milton, Scarborough, Selman. Okay, city marshal, I think. They enticed Martin Morose to come back across to the other side, and they wanted to meet him one night on the old railroad trestle that came across the Rio Grande at El Paso. So as the story goes, Martin Morose cautiously at night came across the bridge with I think it was Selman, and as he got to the U.S. side, the lawman said, "Throw up your hands," and he went for his gun and he started to shoot, and Jeff Milton shot him in the heart, and then Scarborough and McMahon both shot him. It's a little known fact that Frank McMahon was the brother-in-law of George Scarborough. So obviously there was some things going on there, and Leon Metz, for one, who I would consider a Hardin, the late Leon Metz, who unfortunately we just lost him a few months ago. He was a Wild West History Association member also, believed conscientiously that this was all Hardin's idea to knock off Morose. So whatever the explanation is, just one of those myths. They killed Morose, now he's out of the way. Now Hardin's sitting pretty in El Paso. He's got the money, all the money. He's got the beautiful girl, and he's set up in El Paso. Now, if you understand about a bad man's mentality, that is the setting for bad things to come, as Dr. Morone, the psychologist, shows us in his book. And of course, bad things did come. Hardin continues his horrible sprees. He gets worse and worse and worse. He drinks more and more and more. And at that time, there were 3 famous watering holes in El Paso: the Wigwam, the Acme Saloon, and the Gym. The Gym was the fanciest one. And I have the stained glass windows from the card room in the upstairs of the Gym saloon, but I've seen pictures of it, and it was one fancy place. It was fancy as any New York dive you could come up with. And Hardin eventually bought half interest in the Wigwam Saloon, and he planned to eventually take it over. And amongst collectors, which I'm one, there are a lot of little chits which are cut out of a big notebook where they kept the account of John Wesley Hardin's bar bills. And so we have a real nice record of him going down, down, down. He would buy quarts of whiskey at night, take it back to his room and drink it all that night. And he'd get in horrible fights with Beulah. And about this time, Hardin had already started on his autobiography, and he wanted Beulah to help him write this. So picture them, you know, working at night, trying to finish his autobiography, and him getting drunk and flashing his pistols. He threatened to kill her several times, and it just went from bad to worse. But one night in May of 1895, I think it was May the 5th, Hardin goes to the Gym Saloon, and he loses $90 in the crap game. And he was about half drunk, so he all of a sudden pulls a pistol and holds it on the, I'm not sure what you call a crap shooter dealer, but I'm going to call him a dealer. Whatever you call it, a croupier, I think is the correct name. But anyway, the guy's name was Phil Baker, I remember that. And so he said, Phil, I want my $90 back. I've lost my $90. And of course, everybody's on edge, and of course, Phil gives him his $90 back. And according to the newspaper accounts in El Paso the next day, it says, Mr. Hardin strode calmly out, daring anyone to approach him. So when John Wesley Hardin was not drunk, he was dangerous, but when he was drunk, he was really bad, really dangerous. Nobody wanted to try to arrest John Wesley Hardin, no lawman. I'll tell you an exception of that in a minute, which is amazing. But anyway, he gets out, he goes back to his boarding house, and next day they write it up in the El Paso paper and tell you the story. But when he did that, Deputy Will Tenike was sent to arrest him. And unfortunately, he was sober when Deputy Tenike went over there and arrested him. And he took him to the sheriff's office and confiscated his pistol. And that pistol is a very rare artifact in the history of the Old West, because it's one of the few instances in the entire history of the Old West where they recorded the serial number. And I'm a collector. You know, there's some collectors that are historians, and not all historians are collectors. So I got into history sort of by the back door from collecting, but I appreciate what these artifacts mean. And here with us now, we have John Wesley Hardin's pistol that was confiscated that hot May night in El Paso. And we have the serial number recorded. And the thing to take away here is that in the history of the West, you read all kinds of accounts of famous people's pistols. You know, Billy the Kid's pistol, Pat Garrett's pistol, Wired Earp's pistol. Here's the gun that killed Billy the Kid. You know, all this stuff. But very few times do you see a weapon that is recorded indisputably in the court records by serial number, because that's a nice thing about guns. There's only one gun of this model with this number on the belly. So we know it was this exact gun. That's what separates this gun from all the others that were claimed to be John Wesley Hardin's guns. So to me, having a weapon of a famous bad man of the West and having it in your hands and feeling it and know that John Wesley Hardin's hands were around this pistol, and it was the pistol that was confiscated that dangerous night in the gym, is pretty exciting. Well, to conclude, I just want to discuss his death with you just a little bit. And the circumstances around John Wesley Hardin's death are fraught with errors and mysteries, and a lot of people don't understand exactly what happened. In fact, really, nobody knows what really happened. But I'll go over some of the main testimony with you here at the risk of taking too long. On the night of August 19th, 1895, John Wesley Hardin's career came to an end. And the way it happened was he had gotten into a squabble with John Silman, who was the, I think they called him city marshal By that time, Jeff Milton, the former chief of police, had resigned after he had arrested Hardin one night. He was really had a bad feud going with John Selman, whose son, John Selman Jr., was on the police force in El Paso. And history tells us that a few nights preceding that John Selman Jr. had arrested Beulah Morose for wildly carrying and threatening to shoot pistols downtown at night while John Wesley Hardin was out of town. Well, when John Wesley came back a few days later, he really got mad at both Selmans for doing that. And he said, "You wouldn't have done that if I were here." And in the paper, he put a hilarious note that I won't go into, but anyway, he threatened John Selman and basically threatened to kill him. So in the Old West, threatening to kill somebody, especially if you had a witness that somebody said that was good enough for you to be able to shoot the guy the next time you saw him and claim self-defense. That happened over and over and over again, because if somebody was heard to threaten your life, then you got off. So the night, and the night of August 19th was one of those hot, horrible nights in El Paso. And 10 o'clock at night, everybody was up because nobody could sleep. They were sweating in their beds. So John Wesley Hardin goes down to the Acme Saloon. He's playing dice with a bartender named Brown, and John Selman, I won't go into all the details, but he simply walks up to his back about 12 feet away, pulls his gun and shoots John Wesley Hardin in the back of the head. Then when Hardin fell down, he shot 3 more times. So I think 4 shots were fired. Hardin was hit in the arm after he fell down. This is another thing you don't get out of the literature, because the entry wounds were from the top. And the 3 doctors that performed the autopsies on Hardin concluded that yes, he was shot in the back of the head, in spite of John Selman claiming that no, he turned around, he went for his gun, and I shot him in the face. There was a bystander there who made the rather funny comment that I would say if John Wesley Hardin was, if John Selman shot John Wesley Hardin in the front, that was good accuracy. But if he shot him in the back of the head, that showed good judgment. So that caused quite a controversy. But ever since then, according to the wounds on Hardin's body, the main bullet exited just over his left eye. And the photograph that the coroner took at that time shows a very small wound right above his eye, which does not look like an exit wound. It looks like an entry wound to any pathologist. I was trained in forensic anthropology, and I know what an exit wound looks like, or what an entry wound looks like. And the fascinating part of this deal is that of the 4 shots that were fired, one of them hit the frame of a mirror in the Acme Saloon and fell on the floor. And the proprietor, George Look, went over and picked it up and put it in a bottle with some cotton. And that bullet is known today and preserved in a collection of William I. Koch. Along with the gun, the original bullet, and other evidence, that ended the life of John Wesley Hardin. But there's still mysteries, there's still work to be done. So join with us in the Wild West History Association to help us find answers to some of these mysteries.